Hi, my name is Garnet Hertz. I'm Canada Research Chair in Design and Media Art. And today what I wanted to talk about is the idea of speculative design in this paper by James Auger from 2013. And there are elements in this paper that I think are very useful for decolonialization and indigenization efforts that I don't really see being developed very much in some of the work. So I'd like to kind of focus on this because this is a technique that I've used with graduate students. And so I wanted to explain this with the idea that hopefully it's useful for other people doing design work that come from a background of speculative or critical design that are interested in doing work that addresses decolonial issues. Okay, so let's begin here. This can be started out by saying, in this article, I present methods and strategies used in the practice of speculative design, describing how a combination of informed extrapolations of how an emerging technology can basically be developed into present possible futures, using a number of different techniques from film and literature and ecology, comedy, and psychology. Okay, so what's being described here in speculative design is basically a blueprint that Black Mirror took up as a TV show on Netflix a few years ago. The idea with speculative design is that you look into the future of where emerging technology is, and you propose and design and imagine a future where this design and technology has gone forward into a space that you can portray through an object. Now that's kind of a mouthful, but let's look at this as an example. Great example. And this is a work, this isn't work that came from James Auger or the research group that was working there at the Royal College of Art. But this is Black Mirror, the TV show, the Netflix show. In this case, what they did is they took an existing technology, a Boston Dynamics walking dog, or like a robot dog type technology that exists in the real world. What they did is they took this existing present technology and they imagined a future where these technologies had gone and basically run amok and created a world where these things were basically hunting humans and doing all sorts of nasty stuff. Okay, so Black Mirror, if you think about pop culture terms and shows, speculative design really kind of lays out the map for Black Mirror. Now, a couple of things that are worth kind of mentioning here before getting into this, and I already am kind of getting into it, but a couple of related fields that are worth mentioning here that are very similar to critical speculative design. And all of these areas basically remove the constraints from the commercial sector that define normative design processes. Okay, these are critical design, discursive design, design probes, and design fictions. In other words, there are a number of different design practices that go on and that are regularly used inside industry, outside of an industry, and also within academia that attempt to look at design outside of just building a better toothbrush or whatever as a product, or better iPhone or whatever, that don't look at just the kind of problem solving of turning a buck. They want to kind of uncover ideas, okay? And this is an important kind of thing to take away and think about in general. There are large fields of design. Here's a thick book, if you can see the thickness of that. Large fields of design that are focused on creating discourse or discussion. Okay, so it's important to think about that. And sometimes, and this kind of work goes by different names. Sometimes it's called strange design. Sometimes it's called this body of work that's not interested in commercial type of applications so much. It's called different things. Okay, so that's one thing to bring into mind and bring to bear. But I'm going to focus on the idea of speculative design here, which is a particular subset of this kind of non-commercial type work. Now, this diagram is great. This diagram really summarizes James Auger's argument quite nicely. Now, the way that this diagram is laid out, and can be a little bit confusing, is that this is the past and this is the future. Okay? The present is right here, smack dab in the middle. Okay? Up here we have technologies, maybe prototypes, ideas, weird robot dogs, R&D departments, new materials, new tech. And as this comes along here, it kind of gets domesticated and turns from kind of like R&D into kind of a domesticated kind of real world product that you can go to Target or Walmart or Canadian Tire or wherever, or Argos or whatever your local discount store is, and buy it. Okay, so it goes through a process of R&D where it becomes domesticated into a real thing. Okay, and this speculative future is the focus of speculative design. Now, I'm kind of interested in that, but I'm much more interested in this stuff. This is where we got some actual legs. This is cool. This is Black Mirror stuff. This is like this. So if we look at this, we have these technologies here that are kind of out there. Robots, smart agents, and stuff like this. It gets domesticated into a real-world product. This is still almost more like an industrial product. Almost more like a YouTube thing than a real-world product. But it gets domesticated into a thing. Now, the jump of here into this speculative future is this. This is Black Mirror, okay? This is the jump that Auger is talking about that takes us into the future. In the case of this future is used as a warning sign for the present, okay? What this is saying, and if you haven't seen the Black Mirror episodes, you really should. This dog episode, where these robots go around hunting people, carrying on like gangsters, slaughtering people, extracting stuff, and doing their own thing in a very kind of scary and intimidating, almost swarm-like way. Robotic and almost inhumane. So this was done to kind of scare people about the present here. This was done as a warning sign. Take it out into the future as a cautionary tale. Cautionary tale. Okay? This is your cautionary tale. Black Mirror-esque kind of tale to say into the present, hey folks, pay attention to this stuff. This stuff can mess you up. This stuff can screw you up, because if you're not paying attention to this stuff and just kind of going along and not paying attention to where it goes, we could end up in here. Okay? And that is one of the main tasks of speculative futures. Okay, a warning sign to the future, from the future into the present, to say, hold on, pay attention to what you're doing, be careful. Okay, now that's cool and interesting, and honestly, a really good avenue to develop a lot of fascinating content. Okay, but another avenue that you can go is this. What you do here, and this is written here, alternative presence. What's done here is, instead of going into the future and jumping out and looking into the future and projecting out onto the future, instead of what's going on here is going into the past. Okay? Going back into the past. Going back into the past and making a detour in history, okay? And then continuing on that detour, or that path that was never taken in history, okay? What would have happened if such and such would have happened, okay? What would have happened if World War II would have ended differently? What would have happened if indigenous people weren't colonized? What would happen if Canada and the United States developed as one country? You know, there's a number of different paths here, and this is commonly used in developing science fiction. I mean, this is used as well, but going back and revising the past and revisiting the past and taking a detour, this historical detour. Now, this is a thing that's actually pretty cool, and that I've been working with some of my grad students, one of which I'm going to show in a minute. Okay, so the technique here is to go back into the past, make a detour, imagine things differently, and reimagining the present as if the past was different. So what I mean here is Wakanda. Wakanda is a really good example of this. Wakanda is this world that's most prominent in Marvel. Well, it's only prominent in the Marvel universe, but it was front and center in the Black Panther movies, movie that came out in 2018. And it featured in other videos, but it really other movies by Marvel. But the idea here is that there's an African country that had a meteorite fall onto it with very, very valuable material on it, and that this country basically started and organized around this material and became very prosperous. Now, this kind of rewinding in history can happen like this, where it's like, well, in the past, or maybe even in the future, this could happen, and it evolves to be different. Now, the thing that's actually really inspiring and really engaging about Wakanda is that it really represents an idea and vision of Africa outside of the lens of colonialism. Okay? Wakanda is really powerful because it's one of the few major blockbuster representations on film, at least in recent kind of Hollywood history that I remember, seeing a vision of Africa that was not colonialized. And I think a lot of people also found that very inspiring, to see the idea of an advanced civilization coming out of Wakanda, and that, quite honestly, it's moving because it could, in many ways, I think there's decent historical grounds to show that Wakanda could have actually happened in some ways if it hadn't been pillaged by colonialism. Now, okay, so we have this idea of Wakanda. Okay, now the idea is that you go back into history, you revise this, you think about a different turn in history, and you develop the present as if the past was different. Now, I started working with, I have a grad student that's working with the Hogan's Alley Society. And the student, and I'm just rifling through paper here, off screen, so this is the work of my graduate student, Kaiwen Yang, and we are going through, Kaiwen and I are going through and discussing and working with Hogan's Alley. Hogan's Alley is a black neighborhood in Vancouver, Canada, that was torn down to build the Georgia Viaduct, which is a freeway. It essentially obliterated and dispersed the only black neighborhood in Vancouver, and it's never really kind of, a lot of those people dispersed, and that community in some ways was quite traumatically dispersed and damaged because of this freeway. So my student is involved in building out different kind of visualizations of what Hogan's Alley could have been if the freeway would have never been built. Now, the technique for doing this with my student, and I'm not sure if you can read that here, but the technique for doing this, okay, so the prompt started with talking to Kaiwen and saying, let's design Hogan's Alley as if it was never torn down. Okay, that's the basic premise. So what's involved next is actually having him research, these are the real historical components of Hogan's Alley. These are real historical things that happened. So what I had Kaiwen do is go through and actually research the real history. Okay. In order to make up a fictitious history, you really do need to understand in detail the real history of what happened and exactly what dynamics were at play. Okay. In addition, I had Kaiwen talk directly to the Hogan's Alley Society, and I had Kaiwen get readings and take suggestions and really be more in the role of a student, trying to listen to the community organization and get suggestions for how he can become brought up to speed on what's going on in Hogan's Alley. And that community component is super, 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 super important, because as for myself, I really don't know that much about Hogan's Alley Society, and for me to pretend like I do is kind of misrepresenting things. And there are a lot of people out there who do a lot of fabulous work that are experts. And so it's really essential to have some community involvement. I just wanted to say that. So design and map out the history of what happened. Then, now this is the detour, okay? This is the detour. We start at 1860s, okay? We have a detour. Now, we basically have here an alternative path, okay? This is what never happened. But I'd almost say that this is maybe what should have happened. You know, I don't think that those people should have been moved off of there. And I think that many people would likely look back at the history of this and say, you know what, that was actually kind of a mistake. Those people, I mean, we could have had an absolutely gorgeous, wonderful, vibrant community there, and it was sort of destroyed for the sake of a road. Yeah, I mean, you can disagree with that if you want, but I think that those people are more important than the road. But the path here is to kind of say, look, we kind of made a bad turn here in history. We went down here. In some ways, we went down the path of, you know, the future, the modernism of, you know, progress, of whatever. We weren't seeing that we were actually, you know, getting rid of these people and causing them massive kind of cultural problems and personal problems, financial problems. So I had Kaiwen go through and write the new history. Go through and actually define those dates. Pick the dates, plan it out, build it, okay? So build out the alternative history and articulate clearly how the Georgia Viaduct could have been different, okay? So what happens then is to take, and then the phases of this were to say, what can we do in terms of building out, and actually my student building out a community that never got the chance to exist. Now, Kaiwen, my student, was initially doing work with the Nikkei National Museum and Cultural Center in the area, and initially was working with the Japanese community, and had started doing this project looking at a Japanese population that were interned in Vancouver in World War II and moved out and displaced, and a number of other not ideal and nasty things that were put onto the Japanese Canadian community in World War II. So he had started with the Japanese community, had built some buildings, and had started developing this idea of a speculative community that is an alternative present for what might have taken place if the if Hogan's Alley wouldn't have been displaced. I should say also that Hogan's Alley was predominantly black, but it also had a lot of people that were from Chinese and Japanese descent. So it's not this. It is true that it is a black neighborhood, and it was unique for that purpose. But there were a number of other immigrant communities that were there and living there. So he started by building out these buildings, okay? And I asked him, so he came to me with some renderings of what maybe, and he comes from a background of architecture. He'd built a tea house, he'd built a different house, and they were just kind of in this open space. So what I said to him, well, where would it actually be housed? Or where would it actually sit? Pick an actual site. And I said, pick an actual site on a map where this would go in Vancouver. Like, let's actually plan this out as a real place. And so what Kaiwen had started doing is planning out building it at where Science World is. And if you're not from Vancouver, this won't look familiar, but if you're in Vancouver, this will probably look familiar. This is BC Place. Science World is there. This is False Creek. So he had focused on trying to build something here as a memorial and site for a speculative Japanese community. Now, after that kind of developed, and after we started looking at how this would be built, where it would be built, it became really obvious that this work has to take place and has to take into account the black community that was around there. So actually, as we put it on the map kind of forced us to look at the local specifics of what we were dealing with, because we kind of stopped doing just looking at a fictitious or speculative Japanese community, and we started putting it onto a site. Okay, and putting that onto the site actually really helped cement things for us. So when putting it onto a site, so Kaiwen was working here, redesigning this area. This area here was Hogan's Alley. Okay. So, Science World. So, this was Science World. This was Hogan's Alley. Because of the proximity of this, and because we actually looked at building out the real kind of alternative present, and thought of this as a site for the Japanese cultural site, we came across this. And the whole issue around Hogan's Alley. Okay, so, and this work is still ongoing, and it's still happening. My graduate student is meeting with the Hogan's Alley people. He's building out prototypes for architecture, and it's sort of going down the path of looking at building a Hogan's Alley cultural center, what that would kind of look like, or what that community would look like today. Now, I think that this is really useful for people in the field of design and actually the field of art as well, because I think that this can be used in several different techniques and several different approaches. This technique of actually going back into history and revising the past and actually taking this historical detour, looking at the point of conflict here, okay? And looking at that as maybe a historical wrong. Okay? looking at that as a historical wrong, going back into history, imagining it that it was different, and going down and building out a future, building out a history of what history would have been like if people would have made good decisions at that point, and change the history and start designing this. Okay, so this present is really kind of powerful, and I think it's really powerful for a couple of different reasons. For one thing, this Wakanda, this vision of Wakanda, of that Marvel had presented, it's inspiring, and it gives a way for designers and the general public to just imagine a goal or an endpoint or the possibilities in a positive way where we could be if we made different historical decisions. And the most powerful thing about this is that there's no reason why this can't be done right now. There are a number of reasons, but maybe none of them are super fabulous, and maybe most of them were founded on really wrong and bad assumptions to begin with. So in terms of building out this Wakanda, building out, the Hogan's Alley society as it could have been, or Hogan's Alley as it might have been today, that's really useful because it gives people an inspiration to look to what to build. And honestly, today, in terms of everything with current events and the pandemic and COVID-19 and all the rest of this lockdown and stuff like this, we really need positive stories. We really need these inspirational kind of things. We really do, I think it's really actually culturally important that artists and designers give people hope. Yeah. Anyhow, so thanks for listening to this. I hope this is useful. So I'd encourage you to take a look at this paper. Take it with a grain of salt, because it was written in 2013. It was done within a context of it really in a reference to commercial product design. Okay, so when reading this, it doesn't really address a lot of issues related to colonial concerns and decolonial concerns. And it's criticized, and I should say the speculative design really was criticized a number of years ago for being aloof and for not being attentive to how to social issues. But it doesn't necessarily need to be like that. We can use other techniques and other things like alternative presence to really go through. And this Black Mirror future scenario stuff is important to do. Okay. There are actually a number of different technologies and a number of different new things and new stuff that's out there that actually deserves looking at critically. So, let's do this Black Mirror, but let's do this too. There are a number of different people and groups that have been wronged in the past. Designers can go back into the past, take a different detour, redesign the history, and reimagine the present. And that can be used as an inspiration for the public. Okay, and it can be used as an inspiration for designers too. Okay, so that's the challenge that I'd give to you. It's to go back into history, look for historical wrongs, work through your design work to try to correct them, and try to build out engaging presents, okay, that are like the Wakanda, that give people an inspiration, and at the same time give a criticism about this past, but does it in an interesting way. Okay? Thanks.